Somewhere in a county office in Western Oregon, there is a filing cabinet, and inside that filing cabinet, there is a report. And inside that report, a government official admits in careful bureaucratic language that he was wrong about everything. He never said it out loud. He never picked up the phone. He typed it, signed it, filed it, and retired. The woman it concerns didn't find out it existed until 2 years after he was gone. This story is about how that report came to be written. It's about 900 bales of wool that an entire industry stamped as garbage, a dead man's leather journal, and a 24-year-old woman with a stock trailer who did the math no one else was willing to do. By the end of it, that garbage will be selling for more money per pound than copper wire. A man in polished loafers will stand at a fence line and ask for help from the person he once called unequipped. And a whole valley will quietly reorganize itself around an idea that fits in a single sentence, written in pencil in a notebook that spent 40 years in a rancher's vest pocket. Before we go on, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel and hit that bell so you never miss a story. And now, let's continue. But before any of that happens, she has to nearly destroy the entire thing, and the margin between saving it and losing it will come down to 20 degrees on a cheap thermometer. Remember that number, 20 degrees. It's coming back. Here's where it starts. 5:15 in the morning, October 2009. Nell Harmon backs her grandfather's stock trailer up to the loading dock of the Alder Creek woolen mill, and there is not another living soul on the property. Just her, the hiss of the air brakes, and 900 bales of raw wool stacked under a corrugated metal overhang like somebody's abandoned mistake. She kills the engine, steps down into the cold. The brass-handled folding knife clipped to her right front pocket catches the first gray light of a Willamette Valley dawn. The mill has been dead for 6 weeks, almost 50 years of carting Oregon fleece into industrial roving, and then, one Thursday in the middle of a recession, the owners locked the doors, sent everyone home, and walked away from everything that wasn't worth the diesel to haul out, including the wool. Every one of those 900 bales carries the same stamp in fading red ink. Rejected, too short in the staple, too coarse for the carting drums, contaminated with burrs and seed heads and bits of timothy grass that jammed a picker teeth and made the floor foreman curse. The kind of fiber the industry calls waste, but listen carefully to what that word actually means here, because this is the hinge the whole story swings on. The machines couldn't handle this wool. That is not the same thing as the wool being broken. A machine rejecting a material tells you about the machine. It tells you almost nothing about the material. There is a difference between those two things, and almost nobody in the industry bothers to remember it. Nell remembers it. She has no choice. It was drilled into her. She grew up on 160 acres of sheep ground outside Philomath, running 200 ewes alongside her grandfather, Walt Harmon. Stocky man, silver hair, pale blue eyes behind round wire-rimmed glasses, and a battered leather journal with a brass clasp that never left his vest pocket. Walt died in March, 7 months ago. He left her the ranch, the ewes, the fences, the debt, and a commodity wool market paying 40 cents a pound. Run the numbers on 40 cents a pound against feed costs, a shearing crew, and veterinary bills, and you arrive at an ugly truth. The ranch has not turned a profit in 3 years. 40 cents. That is what the market decided an entire year of an animal's growth was worth. Less than a cup of gas station coffee. So when Nell overhears 2 men at the Philomath feed store talking about a mountain of rejected wool rotting on the Alder Creek dock, she doesn't laugh along with them. She asks questions. How many bales? What condition? And the question that matters most, the one that makes her drive out before sunrise. Who is in charge of getting rid of it? The answer turns out to be a skeleton crew of receivers, the handful of accountants left behind to close the books on a dead business. And those receivers are staring at a contract that says a disposal company will haul the wool to a landfill site in Marion County for $75 per bale. 900 bales, $67,500 in disposal fees. That number is sitting on somebody's desk right now like a migraine that will not go away. Nell walks into the receiving office and finds a tired man named Marv eating a gas station burrito over a stack of invoices. She makes him an offer. She will haul every bale, every single one, for free. No charge to the mill, no charge to anyone. Just sign the release and the dock will be clear inside a week. Marv looks up at her, a wiry young woman with a dark chestnut braid hanging past her left shoulder, loose wisps of hair at the temples, a faded olive canvas jacket, jeans worn pale at the knees. And he laughs. Not a cruel laugh, a confused one. The laugh of a man who cannot construct a single reason why anyone on earth would volunteer to take on someone else's trash. He signs the release in under 2 minutes. He doesn't even read the handwritten liability waiver she slides across the desk. Why would he? In his ledger, this problem just erased itself. In her ledger, something very different just happened, but we'll get to her ledger. She starts loading alone, bale hooks, a hand truck, and her own back. Each bale runs about 150 pounds, compressed and bound in twine, and the wool smells of lanolin and dust and something faintly sweet underneath, like clover gone to seed. She has the first trailer half loaded when the tan loafers show up. Craig Pell, County Agricultural Extension Agent, tall, lean, sandy hair parted like he's posing for a government pamphlet, tortoiseshell glasses, pressed khakis without a wrinkle on them, a stainless steel clipboard with the county seal stickered on the back, held against his hip the way a knight holds a shield. He stands at the edge of the dock and watches Nell wrestle a bale onto the trailer bed, and he waits until she is out of breath before he speaks. Miss Harmon, I heard you were out here. I want to make sure you understand that raw wool at this volume carries lanolin concentrations that can exceed county runoff thresholds. If you intend to process any of this, you're looking at permits, an environmental review, possibly a full containment plan. He tilts his chin up slightly, the way a man does when he wants you to know he is doing you a favor just by explaining the rules to you. Your grandfather's place barely passes inspection as it stands. I would hate to see you take on something you're not equipped to handle. Not equipped to handle. Hold on to that phrase, because it is going to travel through this entire story and come out the other end transformed. A man in polished loafers, standing on a loading dock he has never lifted a bale from in his life, has just told a woman who has been shearing sheep since she was tall enough to hold the handpiece that she is not equipped. Nell looks at him, gray-green eyes, steady, giving him absolutely nothing. She nods once. Then she turns back to the bale, sets the hook, and drags it up onto the trailer. She does not say a single word. Pell writes something on his clipboard and walks back to his county truck, and the contempt hangs in the morning air behind him like diesel exhaust. It takes her 5 days. 5 days of running the 12 miles between the mill and the ranch, loading and unloading, stacking bales in the old hay barn and along the south side of the equipment shed under tarps she bought with money she did not really have. By day 3, the neighbors have noticed. It would be hard not to. Her truck and trailer shuttling back and forth on the highway, bales piled so high the tarp ropes hum in the wind. On day 4, Dot Kessler pulls up to the gate, broad-shouldered, ash-blonde hair streaked with gray, mud-caked rubber boots, a dented green thermos in one hand. She has run cattle and sheep on the neighboring place for 30 years, and she stands with her arms crossed, watching Nell cut the twine on a bale and pull the fleece open to check the fiber inside. "What in the hell are you planning to do with a mountain of trash wool?" Dot asks. Nell teases a lock of fleece apart between her fingers. Short staple, maybe 2 inches, shot through with seed heads. She holds it up to the light and turns it slowly. "Learn what it wants to be," she says. Dot stares at her for a long moment. Then she shakes her head, climbs back in her truck, and drives home. Fair enough. It is exactly the kind of answer that sounds like nonsense right up until the day it doesn't. That night, the farmhouse kitchen is dark except for the bulb over the sink. Nell sits at the table with her boots still on, her braid undone and loose across her shoulders, and she opens Walt's leather journal to a page bookmarked with a dried sprig of lavender. His handwriting is small and angular, pressed hard into the paper, and the line she reads has been underlined twice. Waste is a material nobody has listened to yet. She reads it 3 times. Then she looks out the black window toward the barn, where 135,000 pounds of rejected wool sits waiting in the dark. And for the first time since March, the house does not feel entirely empty. Morning light hits the barn, and the work begins with a ruler. Nell unstacks the first 50 bales and starts sorting wool by hand, pulling fleeces apart, lock by lock, and grading them by staple length against a wooden ruler Walt carved himself, maple, worn smooth at the edges, with notch marks scratched in at 2 inches, 3 inches, and 4. She holds each lock against it, stretches the fiber gently between thumb and forefinger, watches how it springs back. The brass-handled knife on her right pocket catches a slant of sun every time she reaches for a new handful. Now, here is the thing about wool that nobody tells you, and nobody told Nell either until she started reading Walt's journal by lamplight. Wool grading is not some vague artistic judgment call. It is measurement, cold, specific measurement. 2 numbers matter more than everything else combined. Staple length, which is how long the individual fibers are, and micron count, which is the diameter of each fiber. A fine merino, the silk of the sheep world, runs around 18 to 22 microns. The wool piled to the rafters in Nell's barn runs 28 to 38. Coarse, the kind of fiber that makes a commercial buyer wrinkle his nose and pass without a second look. But coarse does not mean useless. Coarse means outerwear. Coarse means rugs that outlive the people who bought them. Coarse means craft yarn with backbone, yarn that holds a stitch and refuses to pill into fuzz after 2 washes. Walt knew this. His journal entry from 1979 says it plain, in his blunt, unhurried hand. The fine wool men want silk. Let them have it. This fiber wants to work. The third problem, after length and coarseness, is vegetable matter.
Seeds, burrs, fragments of hay tangled into every lock. Nell picks through it with her fingers, pulling out dried thistle heads and tiny brown seeds that crumble when she pinches them. The worst locks go into a separate reject pile. The cleaner material goes into burlap feed sacks labeled with a grease pencil. Short staple in one, long staple in another. She works 6 hours before she finishes the first 50 bales, and by the end, her hands are coated in lanolin so thick her fingerprints have vanished under a film of wax. Sorted wool is still filthy wool. Next, it has to be washed, and this is where Walt's journal stops being a keepsake and becomes a blueprint. She builds a scouring station straight from his sketches. 3 galvanized stock tanks set in a row on cinder blocks along the barn's south wall. The first tank sits closest to a wood-fired barrel stove she drags in from the equipment shed. A squat iron cylinder with a rusted chimney pipe she wires up to vent through a gap in the siding. The system is simple. Tank 1 gets the hottest water and a measured handful of wood ash lye, potassium carbonate she leaches herself from the ash pile behind the house. Tank 2 is a warm rinse. Tank 3 is cool, clean water. The wool moves down the line, tank to tank to tank. The chemistry underneath this is genuinely beautiful if you slow down long enough to look at it. Lanolin, the waxy grease coating every fiber of raw fleece, is a wax ester. The alkaline lye saponifies it, which is a chemist's way of saying it converts the grease into a crude soap that dissolves in the hot water and carries the dirt away with it. The hot water emulsifies what's left, lifts it into suspension, floats it off the fiber instead of letting it sit there. Wood ash, rainwater, and heat. People were doing this 1,000 years before anyone built a mill. For days, the barn smells like wet sheep and campfire smoke, a dense animal warmth that settles into Nell's clothes, her hair, the wood of the walls themselves. And then the first failure hits, and it hits like a hammer. She loads a full bale's worth of raw wool into tank 1. She has the barrel stove roaring, and the old thermometer from Walt's workshop reads 160 degrees. Her thinking is simple and completely reasonable. Hotter is better. Hotter is faster. Hotter is more efficient. It is none of those things. When she pulls the wool out 20 minutes later, it is not wool anymore. It is a mat, a dense, felted slab of fiber fused into itself by heat and agitation, completely unspinnable, completely unusable. She stands there holding it while water streams down her forearms and the weight of it settles across her shoulders. Not the physical weight, the other kind. An entire bale gone.
One wrong number on a thermometer and 150 pounds of material just became exactly what the mill said it was: garbage. And here is where the story could have ended, because that same week, a letter from the county arrives, and Nell puts it in the kitchen drawer without needing to read it twice. The property taxes on the ranch are 4 months overdue. There is a number in that letter and a deadline, and neither one cares how she feels about wool. Every bale she ruins is not just fiber lost, it is time lost, and time is the one thing the letter in the drawer is counting. That night, back at the kitchen table, she opens the journal and hunts. Page after page of fencing notes, lambing records, pasture rotations. And then she finds it. An entry on scouring, written decades ago, pressed hard into the paper like the old man was arguing with someone. Never boil. The fiber remembers heat the way skin remembers a burn. Keep it under 140. 140. Not 160. 20 degrees. That is the entire distance between usable fiber and a felted brick. That is the margin this whole enterprise lives inside. The next morning, she watches that thermometer like a hawk over a field. 135. 138. She pulls the wool the moment it touches 140, and not 1 degree later. And this time, the fiber comes out loose, clean, and springy between her fingers, while the lanolin lifts away in a yellowish scum on the surface of tank 1. She skims it off with a slotted spoon, and she allows herself exactly one long breath of relief before moving to the next batch. Carding comes next. In the workshop, she finds Walt's old paddle carders, 2 flat wooden paddles studded with fine wire teeth, the handles worn into the shape of his grip. She loads a handful of clean wool onto one paddle and draws the other across it, pulling the fibers parallel, building what spinners call a rolag, a soft cylinder of aligned fiber ready for the wheel. The sound is a quiet metallic whisper, wire teeth combing through wool, over and over and over. Her forearms start burning after 30 minutes. After an hour, they shake. She can card about 2 pounds an hour, and she has thousands of pounds ahead of her. She does not think about the thousands. She thinks about the 2. Then, spinning. Walt's drop spindle hangs on a peg in the workshop, a wooden shaft with a weighted whorl at the bottom, simple as a toy and older than the pyramids as a technology. She ties on a leader yarn, attaches a drafted length of fiber, gives it a twist, and lets it drop. The first yarn she produces is a thick, lumpy rope that looks like something a preschooler made at summer camp. She tries drafting thinner. The yarn snaps. She rejoins it and tries again. It snaps again. For 3 days, she fights that spindle, and the spindle wins every single round, and the floor around her boots fills up with tangled, useless attempts. Then she finds the note. It is tucked into the journal between 2 entries about fence repair, 3 lines in pencil, like Walt jotted it down mid-thought 40 years ago and never imagined who would need it. Draft with your breath, not your hands. The fiber will tell you how thin it wants to go. Your job is to listen, not to argue. She slows down. She breathes. She lets the twist travel up into the drafting zone before she pulls more fiber. And somewhere in the middle of that quiet afternoon, something clicks into place. The rhythm stops being something she imposes on her hands and becomes something her hands discover on their own. That evening, she holds up her first completed skein of hand-spun yarn. It is lumpy, it is uneven, it is, by any commercial standard, amateur work. It is also intact, start to finish, and it took her 11 hours of labor. She hangs it on a nail in the barn wall, right next to Walt's maple ruler, like a badge of honor, or maybe like a dare. By the 3rd week, she has scoured and carded 40 pounds of clean wool, and 6 skeins hang on the barn wall. And here is the detail worth noticing. Each one is visibly better than the one before it. The first skein, the lumpy 11-hour marathon, still dangles from its nail. But the 6th has a tighter twist and a more even draft, because tension, it turns out, is a conversation between your grip and the fiber always tells you when you are pulling too hard. Her hands half knew this already, from years of watching Walt's thick fingers work rope and leather. Now the knowledge is moving from her eyes into her fingertips, where it actually belongs. And she gets faster, deliberately, methodically. She tears apart an old stock tank, scrubs it with vinegar, sets it on cinder blocks over a second firebox. A bigger vat means more wool per batch. She tapes a candy thermometer to a dowel rod, which looks ridiculous and works perfectly, and holds her wash water at a steady 140, never higher. That lesson cost her a bale, and she only needed to pay for it once. A rhythm emerges, and the days organize themselves around it. Scour in the morning, while the air is cool and steam rises off the tanks in pale sheets. Card in the afternoon, the raw locks flowing between the paddles like cotton candy. Spin in the evening, under the barn's single bulb, at the old Ashford wheel she resurrected from the loft, her foot working the treadle until the bobbins fill. It is not fast by any industrial measure. It is steady. And steady, sustained long enough, starts to look a lot like relentless. And then the tan loafers crunch up the gravel drive again. Craig Pell has a new form this time. Of course he does. The tortoiseshell glasses catch the morning light as he steps out of the county truck, the stainless steel clipboard tucked under his arm like a weapon he is far too polite to draw. He explains, patient and measured, chin lifted just slightly, that her scouring runoff is draining into the lower pasture. Lanolin-laden water, he says, potentially reaching Briar Creek. There are regulations about this. There are thresholds. He presents the compliance form with 2 fingers, the way you hand a parking ticket to someone you suspect can barely read. You understand, Miss Harmon, this is not optional. The county can levy fines starting at $200 per incident. He pauses long enough to let that number land in the yard between them, and then he says it again, the phrase he apparently keeps in the same pocket as his pens. I would hate to see you dig yourself deeper into something you are not really equipped to handle. There it is. That smooth, institutional contempt, wrapped in concern, the way a razor blade gets wrapped in a handshake. Nell takes the form. She reads every line of it, slowly, standing right there in front of him, which takes long enough to become uncomfortable for exactly one of the 2 people present. Then she folds it once and slides it into the back pocket of her jeans. I'll need a receipt, she says. 4 words, a door, closing quietly. Pell blinks, writes her a receipt from a carbon pad, and drives away. And if the gravel crunches a little harder under his tires on the way out, well, gravel does that sometimes. Now pay attention to what she does next, because this is the move that separates this story from 100 other stories about stubborn people. She does not fight the regulation. She does not write an angry letter or call a lawyer she cannot afford. She goes back to the journal, because by now she has learned the shape of the old man's mind, and she has a suspicion. She is right. That night, she finds a page she has not reached before, with a heading in Walt's blocky capitals. Wash, water, garden. Below it, a diagram. A shallow trench lined first with gravel, then coarse sand, then fine sand, feeding into a planted bed of cattail roots. The old man had designed a gray water filtration system for exactly this problem, scouring runoff, and never built it because he never processed enough wool to need it. His note at the bottom of the page reads like a shrug and a philosophy at the same time. Lanolin feeds the cattails. Cattails clean the water. Nothing wasted. The land does not need a whip. It needs a meal. Nell builds it in 4 days. She digs the trench with a mattock and a flat shovel. She hauls gravel up from the dry creek bed in 5-gallon buckets until her palms blister through the calluses. She transplants cattail rhizomes from the boggy corner near the fence line, and she runs her scouring outflow through a garden hose into the head of the bed. Within 2 weeks, the cattails explode. Fat green shoots, drinking that lanolin-rich water like it is fertilizer, which, chemically speaking, is precisely what it is. Dissolved organics, trace nutrients, exactly the meal the old man promised. Then she does the part that matters. She collects a water sample from the outflow end of the bed, drives it to the county lab in Corvallis herself, and pays for the analysis out of grocery money. The results come back inside the week. Clean, well within every threshold on Pell's form, with room to spare. She makes a photocopy of the lab report, seals it in an envelope, and mails it to Craig Pell's office with no cover letter, not one word, just the numbers. Some arguments you win by talking. The best ones you win by mailing a man a piece of paper he cannot argue with. And with the water question settled, Nell finally turns to the back third of the journal, the section she has been saving, the pages that are about to change what this whole operation actually is. The die notes. They start past the wool grades and the pasture charts, and they go on for pages. Madder root, planted along the south fence line in 1979, with a note beside the date. See what happens. Weld, a tall biennial, seated near the old chicken coop for yellow. Black walnut, the big heritage tree by the creek. Hulls gathered in October for brown. Every entry meticulous. Mordant ratios written out as percentages of fiber weight. 10% alum for madder. 6% alum plus 6% cream of tartar for weld. No mordant needed for walnut because the tannins do the binding work themselves. Expected colors sketched beside each recipe in colored pencil, faded now but still legible. Walt Harmon had been building a dye garden for 30 years, and nobody knew. Not the neighbors, not the county, possibly not even his granddaughter, until this exact moment, at this exact kitchen table. The next morning, Nell walks the south fence line, and the madder is still there, alive. 3 years of unharvested growth, which for madder means the roots have gone thick and deep and are absolutely packed with pigment. She digs a plant with a garden fork, shakes off soil that comes away faintly red-stained, and snaps a root in half. The inside is the color of dried blood. She carries 2 pounds of root back to the barn and chops it fine on the old cutting board, and afterward the brass-handled knife goes back on her pocket with a faint orange stain at the hinge that never fully comes out again. She fills a stainless pot, brings the water up to 180 degrees, and holds it there because the journal is emphatic on this point. Any hotter and the alizarin, the pigment molecule itself, starts breaking down, and the color goes muddy and dull. She simmers the chopped roots for 2 hours, and the kitchen fills with a smell like turned earth and something much older than the house. She strains the bath through muslin. The liquid is a deep blood orange, nearly black at the edges of the pot. The yarn goes in already prepared, soaked overnight in an alum solution at 10% of the fiber's weight. And here is the chemistry that separates real natural dyeing from tie-dye at summer camp, the reason this color will still be alive in the yarn decades from now. Alizarin, the pigment in madder, bonds to the aluminum ions from the mordant. The aluminum, in turn, bonds to the protein structure of the wool itself, keratin, the same protein as human hair. 3 layers, locked together at the molecular level. This is not a stain sitting on a surface, waiting to wash out. It is a chemical marriage between color and fiber, and it does not divorce. She leaves the yarn in the cooling bath overnight because slow cooling deepens the take, and in the morning she lifts the first skein out with a wooden spoon and just stands there. It is a deep, earthy terracotta red with subtle variation running the whole length of it. Darker where the twist is tighter, lighter where the fiber opened up in the bath. No factory dye lot in the world looks like this, because factories are built to eliminate exactly this kind of variation, and it turns out the variation was the beautiful part all along. She hangs it on the barn wall. Then she does it again with weld and gets a warm goldenrod yellow. Then walnut hulls, a rich chocolate brown that smells like autumn itself. For blue, she has nothing growing yet, so she orders a cake of natural indigo from a supplier, ferments and reduces a small vat by the journal's instructions, and makes a quiet note to herself that next spring she will try growing her own. The vat gives her a dusky, contemplative blue, the color of the sky at the exact moment the porch light becomes necessary. Within 2 weeks, there are 12 skeins on the barn wall: madder red, weld yellow, walnut brown, indigo blue, and the undyed naturals, cream and oatmeal, and a soft gray from the darker fleeces. No two skeins identical. The effect, hanging there against the weathered boards, is like a painter's palette that grew straight up out of the ground, which, if you think about it, is exactly what it is. Dot Kessler shows up on a Thursday, not for any reason, just passing, she says, the dented green thermos dangling from one broad hand. Then her eyes land on the yarn wall, and she goes completely still. She crosses the barn floor without a word. She reaches out and touches a skein of the madder red with fingers that have pulled calves and mended wire for 30 years, and for a long moment she says nothing at all. "How much would you sell this for?" Dot finally asks, and her voice is different than Nell has ever heard it, quieter. Nell has not thought about selling. Not once. She has been so deep inside the making of the thing that the idea of commerce has not entered the barn even once. Dot reads the answer off her face. "My sister knits," Dot says. "She would lose her mind over this." She leaves with nothing but the question, and the question stays. Nell stands alone in the barn, looking at 12 skeins of color that no factory could replicate, because no factory would ever tolerate the slowness required to make them. And somewhere under her ribs, an idea she has been refusing to have finally introduces itself. A Tuesday night in November, Nell sits at the kitchen table with a $20 calculator and a ruled notebook, working out what her yarn actually costs to make. The kitchen smells like cold coffee and wood ash. One bulb over the table throws hard light on the columns she has scratched into the paper. Materials on the left, hours on the right. Raw wool, free. The rejected fleeces in her barn cost her nothing but fuel and the willingness to haul what an entire industry called garbage. Scouring supplies, the bulk lye, and the firewood to heat the wash water come out to roughly 40 cents per pound of clean fiber. Mordants and dye materials land around 60 cents per pound, and most of that is alum bought in 25-pound sacks because the madder grows on her own fence line, the walnut hulls fall from a tree older than the house, and the goldenrod and tansy she cuts along the ditches for free. So the hard cost of a finished 4-ounce skein of worsted weight yarn, 1/4 of 1 pound, comes to about 25 cents in materials. 25 cents. She stares at that number for a long time. Then there is labor, and here the math gets strange. A single 4-ounce skein, from raw, greasy fleece to finished product, represents about 3.5 hours of handwork.
Scouring, drying, picking, carding, spinning, plying, dyeing, rinsing, drying again, twisting into a skein. Every step slow, every step done by hands and attention, and a kind of patience that no machine was ever built to imitate. She does not know what to charge for her own time. She leaves the labor column blank and moves on, which is what everyone does with that column, right before the market answers the question for them. Her laptop sits open at the far end of the table. She has been searching. Small batch artisan yarn, hand-dyed, hand-spun. The world that lives on craft marketplaces and fiber festival tables, sold by tiny operations with names full of moons and thistles. And the prices stop her cold. $24 a skein, 30, 36, for 4 ounces of yarn, 1/4 of a pound. She pulls up a commodity price chart to check herself. Raw wool, the good stuff, the stuff the mills actually want, is trading at 40 cents a pound.
The stuff they do not want, the short and the coarse and the contaminated, trades at zero, below zero really, because you pay a hauler to take it to a landfill. Now watch the arithmetic, because this is the moment the entire story pivots on. A finished 4-ounce skein selling for $28 works out to $112 per pound of finished product, from a raw material that cost her nothing, from a raw material that the previous owners were prepared to spend $67,500 just to make disappear. $112 a pound. She sets the calculator down, picks it up, runs it again. Same answer. That is more per pound than copper wire. It is more per pound than some cuts of beef tenderloin. And the entire difference between 0 and 112 is nothing but human hands, plant chemistry, and time. Have you ever looked at something the whole world agreed was worthless and actually realized down in your gut that the world was simply wrong? Not because you were smarter than everyone else, because you were willing to do the work no machine would do and to listen to a material everyone else had stopped listening to. That is exactly where Nell Harmon is sitting right now, at a scarred kitchen table, with a dead man's journal pushed to one side and a cheap calculator repeating the same impossible number every time she asks. The next morning, she carries 6 skeins out to the barn. Walt's old workbench sits under the south window, and at 9 in the morning, the November light comes through it low and gold. She lays each skein on the weathered wood, the terracotta red from the madder, the deep amber gold from weld overdyed with a whisper of walnut, a soft sage green from tansy shifted with iron water, each one a little different from its neighbor. The color has depth. The twist shows the hand that made it. The texture catches light in a way that makes factory yarn look embalmed. She sets Walt's hand carders beside them, his wool comb tines dark with decades of lanolin, his wire-rimmed reading glasses folded on their braided leather cord. And she takes photographs with a 3-year-old phone with a cracked screen protector. No filters, no lights, just skeins on old wood next to the tools of the man who taught her what the word waste actually means. The images are simple. They are also, and she can see this even on the cracked screen, quietly striking, because the colors are alive in a way that requires no explanation, and the worn steel and weathered grain tell a story no marketing copy could fake. That night, she is back at the kitchen table, and it is past 11, and this is the low point, so let's not rush past it. The wood stove has burned down to coals. The kitchen is cold enough that her breath shows. She has been working 16-hour days for the better part of 2 months, and she has earned exactly $0. The tax letter is still in the drawer behind her, and she does not need to take it out to remember the number inside it or the deadline. The cursor blinks in an empty listing form on the laptop screen. She could sell the ranch, pay the taxes off, take the job at the feed store in Corvallis, the one with the hiring sign she pretended not to see last week. Let somebody else figure out what to do with 160 acres that Craig Pell has already told half the county is mismanaged. She can still hear his voice from the one time she went into the extension office for well records, that smooth clipboard drawl, delivered with a smile like he was doing her a kindness. "Sweetheart, your grandfather was a tinkerer. Tinkerers don't build anything that lasts. The doubt is real." It sits on her chest like a stone. And anyone who tells you the doubt was not real is telling you a worse story than the true one. She reaches across the table and picks up the journal, opens it at random, somewhere in the middle, and lands on a sketch of a fleece staple with measurements down the margin in that precise, unhurried, military straight hand. The handwriting of a man who never once doubted that careful work, done in the right order, adds up to something. She sits with the page for a while. Then she closes the journal, pulls the laptop closer, and starts typing. Each listing tells the truth, plainly, the way Walt would have said it. Rejected mill wool, hauled off a bankrupt loading dock, hand-scoured in rainwater heated over a wood fire, hand-carded, hand-spun on a decades-old wheel, dyed with madder root from a patch her grandfather planted 30 years ago, with walnut hulls from a tree older than the ranch house, with weld and tansy cut on the property. Nothing synthetic, nothing wasted. Every skein unique, because uniqueness is what hands produce and machines prevent. 40 skeins, $28 each. She hits publish a little before midnight, closes the laptop, and goes to bed, not expecting much of anything. She wakes up, walks to the kitchen, opens the laptop with one hand while reaching for the coffee tin with the other, and then she stops reaching for the coffee tin. Zero skeins remaining. All 40 gone. Sold out between midnight and 6 in the morning, purchased by strangers in cities she has never set foot in, while she slept in a drafty farmhouse with wool grease still under her fingernails. 40 skeins at $28, $1,120 in one night, while she was unconscious. And there are messages, 11 of them, buyers asking when more will be listed, whether she takes custom orders, what breed the sheep are.
A weaver in Vermont writes that the yarn in the photographs has the most honest color she has seen in 15 years at a loom. A woman in Boise wants the exact dye recipe for the red, and Nell smiles at that one because the recipe is buried in a dead man's handwriting and 30 years of root growth, and no, it does not travel. But it is the 11th message that makes her sit down slowly and read twice. A knitwear designer in Portland. Small studio line, 3 boutiques, and a seasonal catalog. She wants 200 skeins for a capsule collection. Madder red and walnut brown. Delivered by spring. 200 skeins. Nell closes the laptop and walks out to the barn. She stands in the doorway and listens to the ewes shifting in their pen, the soft tearing sound of hay being pulled from a bale, and she does the math the way Walt taught her to do math, not on paper first. Standing inside the place where the work actually happens, feeling the true weight of it.
Her monthly costs to keep the ranch alive run about $1,800. Feed, taxes, insurance on the truck, fuel, electricity. $1,800 a month just to hold the ground and feed the animals. At $28 a skein, that is 65 skeins a month to break even. Her real bottleneck is not scouring or carding, it is the wheel. Spinning sets the pace of everything, and at her current skill, working the wheel every evening and most of every Sunday, she can finish about 30 skeins a week. Call it 120 in a good month. 65 keeps the lights on. Everything above it is the first profit this ranch has seen in 3 years. The numbers work, barely, with no slack and no sick days, but they work. She goes back inside, pours the coffee she forgot to make, and answers every single message personally, one at a time. She explains the process, the hand scouring, the plant dyes, the line drying in the loft. She explains the timeline, that each batch takes days, not hours. She explains her limits, plainly and without apology. She is one person on one ranch with one pair of hands, and she does not promise what she cannot deliver. To the Portland designer, she writes 3 sentences. I can supply 20 skeins per month, madder red and walnut brown in alternating batches. The quality will be worth the wait. Those are my terms. The reply comes back within the hour. No negotiation, no counteroffer, just yes. Now here is where the thing picks up its own momentum, the way a creek swells after a week of quiet rain. Word moves through the online fiber communities, the forums and pattern boards and mailing lists where knitters and weavers trade sources the way farmers trade seed catalogs. Buyers post photographs of Nell's yarn in finished work, and other people stop scrolling when they see it. The color variation in each skein reads not as a defect, but as a fingerprint, the visible record of matter releasing its pigment unevenly so that every inch of fiber carries a slightly different saturation. The hand feel gets its own discussion thread because the wool is softer than anyone expects coarse fiber to be. Industrial scouring strips fleece with hot solvents and leaves it harsh. Nell's slow wash coaxes the grease out gently and leaves a whisper of natural oil behind in the fiber, and hands can tell the difference even when eyes cannot. And then there is the story itself, the rejected bales, the bankrupt mill, the grandfather's journal, the ranch everyone said should be sold.
A popular knitting blog runs a feature under a headline that makes Nell laugh out loud alone in her kitchen. The wool nobody wanted is the yarn everyone's fighting over. Understand what she does not have at this point. She does not have a website.
She does not have a brand name, a logo, a business card, or $1 of advertising spend. She has yarn, a waiting list, and a reputation traveling from one pair of hands to the next. The brass-handled knife stays clipped to her right front pocket. The journal stays open on the kitchen table. The work does not change, only the demand does. In January, she counts the season's ledger. The taxes are paid in full. With a money order, she drives to the county office herself and hands across the counter in person. And if there is a small private satisfaction in watching a clerk stamp that particular piece of paper, she keeps it off her face. By February, there are 340 names on the waiting list, and every single one of them found her through another customer's hands. And the community begins to shift in the quiet way communities actually shift, not with announcements, with footsteps on a gravel drive. Dot Kessler comes by on an afternoon, boots leaving mud prints on the porch steps, thermos in hand, and this time her sister is with her, a broad-faced woman with Dot's same dark blue eyes and the same square jaw, and she is wearing a scarf, madder red, hand-knitted in a loose-ribbed stitch that shows off the yarn's slight irregularity, the way each strand catches light at its own angle because it was spun by a human being on a wheel that wobbles just a little. The scarf is not pretty. Pretty is the wrong word. It is beautiful in the specific way of objects that make you reach out and touch them before you realize your hand has moved. Dot stands on the porch with her arms crossed, and she asks quietly whether Nell would teach her the scouring. Not the whole operation, just the wash, just how to clean a fleece without wrecking it. Nell says yes. That is the entire ceremony, a nod and a date set for Saturday. And then, some weeks later, the county truck comes up the drive again, and something about it is different before the door even opens. When Craig Pell steps out, the stainless steel clipboard is not in his hand. It is lying on the passenger seat. His tan loafers are dusty. He stands at the fence line, glasses catching the flat, late winter light, and he asks Nell a question. Not a compliance question, a real one. The county, he says, has been receiving inquiries, other small operations, asking about wool washing, about runoff, about gray water management for on-farm processing. He clears his throat. The chin is still slightly lifted, out of decades of habit, but the smugness has gone out of it like steam off a cooling pan. He asks whether she would be willing to share the design of her filtration bed. Nell looks at him for a moment. Then she goes inside without a word and comes back with a single photocopied page. Walt's diagram of the washwater garden, gravel and sand and cattails, annotated in the old man's cramped hand. She holds it out. Pell takes it, looks at it longer than a diagram that simple requires, folds it once, puts it in his shirt pocket, thanks her in 4 or 5 stiff words, and drives away. She watches the truck go and thinks, not unkindly, that the page came from the tinkerer who never built anything that lasts. Spring comes to the Harmon place like a slow green explosion, and it changes the scale of everything. Along the south fence line, the madder patch Walt seeded decades ago wakes up in earnest, dense, sprawling stems and those small, star-whorled leaves that look far too modest to be hiding the color they are hiding. Nell crouches at the edge of it one morning, braid over her shoulder, knife catching the early light, and pulls one root from the loose soil, snaps it. The inside is that same dried blood red, and the patch runs 40 feet down the wire. She does the estimate standing right there in the dirt. At this density, harvested in rotation and replanted as she goes, this one bed could yield pigment for hundreds of skeins a year. Managed correctly, close to 1,000. Managed correctly is carrying a lot of weight in that sentence, so she manages it correctly, with the journal open on an overturned bucket beside her. Walt's planting notes are specific to the point of bossiness. Weld for yellow, sow in fall, let it overwinter, harvest the flowering stalks in the second summer, coreopsis for gold and burnt orange, direct seed after last frost, full sun, cut the flower heads just past their peak, and Japanese indigo, the tricky one, the one she promised herself back in the winter. Start it indoors, transplant only after the soil holds 60 degrees, harvest the leaves before first flower, when the pigment precursors peak. She orders seed from 3 suppliers, cross-references Walt's soil notes, and gets to work. And by midsummer, the bought cake of indigo is retired for good. From here on, even the blue grows on the place. And here is where the whole system quietly reveals itself as one connected organism, which is the part of this story that engineers and gardeners tend to fall in love with. Remember the cattail bed, the filtration garden that turned a compliance threat into a lab report. The water leaving that bed is clean enough for irrigation, but it is not empty. It carries trace lanolin, dissolved organic matter, nutrients pulled from the wool itself. When Nell runs the outflow to the new dye beds through a simple gravity channel, the plants respond like they have been waiting for it. The madder roots thicken. The weld comes in dense and resinous. The coreopsis blooms so heavily the flower heads overlap like shingles. Being Walt's granddaughter, she does not trust it until she tests it. Side by side. Matter from the irrigated beds against matter from a control patch on plain well water. Same fiber, same mordant, same temperature. The irrigated roots throw a color that is visibly deeper, richer, more saturated, and she stands there holding the 2 skeins up to the light for a long time. Follow the loop, because it is worth saying out loud. The wool's own wash water feeds the plants. The plants clean the water and grow the pigment. The pigment goes back onto the next batch of wool. Waste in, color out, around and around. And a line from the journal, dated decades back, sits underneath the whole design like a foundation stone. Waste is a material nobody has listened to yet. Nobody is laughing at that sentence anymore. Nobody within 3 counties anyway. Then comes the accident that opens the second half of the palette. Nell has been mordanting with alum, which gives clean, bright tones. Matter on alum yields that warm terracotta, beautiful, reliable, repeatable. But one afternoon, an old iron nail goes into a cooled madder bath, dropped by accident off the edge of the workbench, and she does not notice until morning. When she comes back, the bath has shifted from orange-red to a deep burgundy brown, so rich it looks like it belongs in the shadowed corner of a Renaissance painting. Iron. Iron ions bond with the tannins and pigments in a dye bath and shift everything toward darker, earthier, more saddened tones, and the old dyers knew it centuries ago. And now Nell knows it because of a dropped nail. She does what she always does with an accident. She turns it into a method. She tests systematically, bath by bath, and writes every result down in a notebook of her own that has started, without her quite deciding it, to look a lot like Walt's. Weld on alum stays bright gold. Weld on iron turns olive green. Coreopsis on alum gives burnt orange. Coreopsis on iron gives a color she can only describe as the inside of a walnut shell. On the barn wall, in the same barn where hundreds of bales of rejected wool still wait in patient stacks, she paints a chart. 12 dye plants down the left side, 3 mordants across the top, alum, iron, copper. 36 squares, and stapled beside each square, a small twist of yarn dyed to match. 36 distinct, repeatable colors, every one of them grown and extracted on this ground, with not one drop of synthetic dye in the building. Up in the loft, she builds the drying system, wooden dowels hung from the rafters on cord, spaced along the length of the barn, each rod carrying its row of skeins, and every skein gets a handwritten tag, dye plant, mordant, date, and the number of the original bale the raw wool came from. Pick up any skein in that loft and you can trace it backward, step by step, all the way to the exact rejected bale that a commodity buyer once consigned to a landfill. The barn becomes something that visitors, when they start coming, will struggle to describe without reaching for church words. Rows of hanging color in the dusty light. Terracotta, olive, burgundy, gold, walnut, indigo so deep it reads like a bruise at dusk. the smell of lanolin and dried flowers and old wood, with something underneath it almost like tea. By the end of her first 6 months of selling, the ledger tells its own story. A little over $19,000 in yarn, sold skein by skein at a kitchen table, with a materials cost that still rounds to almost nothing. And the supply question, when she finally sits down to answer it properly, comes out sounding like a joke with a straight face. 900 bales at roughly 150 pounds each is about 135,000 pounds of raw wool. Even now, with production climbing and Dot learning the wash tanks, the operation runs through maybe 60 pounds of raw fleece in a week. Divide it out, and the answer is more than 40 years of supply, sitting in her barn, hauled for free off a dock where it was scheduled to cost somebody $67,500 to throw away. Let that sit for a second. She has more raw material than she can use in a working lifetime, and her total acquisition cost was diesel and a sore back. Then the neighbors start arriving, quietly. No announcements, because that is not how this valley does anything. Just trucks in the drive. Dot comes first, naturally. 12 bales of short staple fleece her commodity buyer rejected outright. Too coarse, too inconsistent, worth nothing at the depot. Nell grades it lock by lock against the maple ruler, sorts it, and pays Dot 50 cents a pound. 10 cents over the going market rate for wool the market would not take at any price. Dot looks at the check, looks at Nell, nods once, and drives home. And that nod contains an entire paragraph that neither of them needs to say out loud. Within 2 months, 4 more ranchers have done the same thing, and something remarkable is now true. Nell is running a supply chain built entirely from her neighbor's waste, paying them better than the market pays for their best, and turning material the whole industry throws away into objects people wait months to receive. Nobody planned this as an economic model. It grew the way the cattails grew, because the conditions were right and something was feeding it. In late spring, a rental car comes up the gravel, and a woman named Anna Ree steps out with a camera bag and a notebook. She writes for a national craft magazine, and she found Nell the way everyone finds Nell, through somebody else's hands. She stays 2 full days. She watches the scouring tanks steam in the cold morning light.
She watches Nell's hands move through fiber with a confidence that looks inborn and was in fact assembled, skein by skein, out of months of cracked skin and felted failures and dye baths that went nowhere. She photographs the 36-square chart on the barn wall. She climbs to the loft and sits among the hanging skeins for an hour, and mostly she just breathes. The profile runs 6 weeks later under a title that Nell will never fully get used to seeing in print: The Woman Who Listened to Wool. The waiting list doubles overnight, and it was not short before. There is one more thing from those early years worth keeping before we jump forward, and it is small, and it is the whole point. The second winter, letters start arriving, actual paper letters mixed in with the feed bills and the seed catalogs. A woman in Minnesota writes that she knitted her father's last sweater out of the walnut brown and that he was buried in it at his own request. A weaver in New Mexico sends a photograph of a blanket, madder and iron-shifted burgundy, in a pattern her grandmother taught her, with a note saying it is the first piece of her own work she has ever refused to sell. A man in Michigan, a retired machinist of all people, writes 2 stiff, careful paragraphs explaining that he took up spinning after his wife passed, that he bought one of Nell's undyed skeins just to study the twist, and that holding work done that honestly made him feel, and this is his phrase, less alone in the practice. Nell keeps the letters in a wooden box on the workbench next to the journal. She does not frame them. She does not photograph them for anyone. But on the hard days, the days when a dye bath fails, or the truck needs a transmission, or the rain gets into a tarp stack, she reads 1 or 2 before bed. Because here is what those letters actually are. Proof that the value she found in the rejected bales was never a trick of marketing or a lucky price point. People are not paying $28 for 4 ounces of coarse wool.
They are paying for the one thing the modern world has made genuinely scarce, which is evidence that a human being stood in a cold barn and gave a material their full attention, hour after hour, until it became worth something. Scarcity is not always about supply. Sometimes it is about care. And care, it turns out, travels intact across 2,000 miles inside a cardboard box, and people recognize it on sight, and they write letters about it to a stranger in Oregon. Walt had a line for this, too, of course. She finds it that same winter in the margins of a page about ram selection, of all places, written sideways in pencil. Do the work like somebody will inherit it. Somebody always does. 15 years later, 2024. The barn has been rebuilt once and expanded twice. The dye garden covers a full acre. Nell Harmon is 39 years old, and there are the first silver threads at her temples now, though the chestnut braid still hangs past her left shoulder, and the freckles across her nose have deepened into something permanent, set there by 15 years of Oregon sun and wood smoke, and the particular patience that slowly turns a person into part of the landscape. The brass-handled knife is still clipped to her right front pocket, the hinge still faintly orange from that first madder harvest. The olive canvas jacket has been replaced twice, same style, same fit. Some things do not need reinventing. The ranch now processes wool from 11 neighboring operations. 11. That number would have made Walt Harmon laugh hard enough to fog up his wire rims. Nell employs 4 women part-time, all of them trained at her elbow on the wash tanks and the dye pots and the wheels, all of them from ranch families that needed income when commodity wool stayed stuck under 50 cents a pound and a second truck payment stopped penciling out. Her annual revenue is $187,000. Her waiting list holds steady at 6 months. A skein now sells for $32, and nobody blinks, because every pound of fiber that leaves that barn has been touched by human hands at every single stage of its transformation, and the people buying it can feel that in a way they cannot always explain. Here is what the mature system looks like for anyone keeping the technical thread. Raw fleece arrives in burlap sacks from around the valley. It goes into the scouring line, still wood ash lye, still rainwater, collected off the barn roof now into a 1,200-gallon cistern. The wash water holds at 140 degrees, kept there by a propane-assisted heater Nell finally installed in 2016, after one winter too many of stoking fires at 4 in the morning. That heater is the single concession she has made to modernity, and she thought about it for 2 years first. The lye does what it has always done. The felting lesson from that ruined first bale has never needed teaching twice. Carding runs on a hand-cranked drum carder now, an upgrade from Walt's paddles, but still manual, still slow, still producing bats with a consistency no industrial card matches, because a machine does not feel the fiber change under its hands, and a person does. 5 spinning wheels stand in a row along the barn's south wall, and on any given Tuesday you can hear all 5 humming at once, 5 women working in a near silence that is nothing like emptiness. Dyeing still happens in copper pots over fireboxes built to Walt's sketch, their patina gone green-black from years of tannin and mineral salts, though the chimneys draw properly now. Every step by hand. She has refused 3 separate offers to mechanize. 3. The refusals get shorter each time. And now the part I promised you at the very beginning, the filing cabinet. Craig Pell retired from the extension office in 2022. Clipboard Pell, polished loafer Pell, the man who told a 24-year-old at a loading dock that she was not equipped and told half the county her grandfather was a tinkerer whose work would not outlive him. Before he cleaned out his desk, he filed one last formal report, a recommendation that the Harmon graywater filtration design, the gravel and sand and cattail system, be adopted as a county model for small-scale agricultural processing across the region. He cited her operation by name.
He wrote it in that bureaucratic dialect he always loved, section headers and bullet points and phrases like demonstrated efficacy over a sustained operational period. He never told her. Not a phone call, not a note, not so much as a nod at the feed store. She found out from a neighbor 2 years after Pell had already moved away to Bend. And that is the thing about men like Craig Pell. They will never say the words with their mouths. But somewhere in a county filing cabinet, there is a signed document that amounts, line by careful line, to a man admitting he was wrong about everything that mattered. And honestly, that is enough. That might even be better. Dot Kessler's place next door carries its own label now. Hand-processed, plant-dyed, sold online and through 3 shops in Portland. Dot learned every technique at Nell's elbow: the matter extraction, the indigo vat, the weld mordant that throws a yellow so pure it looks like bottled sunlight. Dot's daughter has gone further still. She and 3 other ranch families in the valley run a natural dye cooperative, sharing dye stock, splitting shipping, cross-listing inventory. What one woman did alone in a cold barn with a dead man's journal, a community now does together. And that sentence is the entire arc of this story compressed to its bones. Mockery, then whispers, then silence, then a handshake, then a whole valley changing how it works. And then, one spring morning, a mud-spattered hatchback comes up the drive, and Josie gets out. She is 22. Dot's grandniece, fresh out of the agriculture program at Oregon State, with a box of books in the back seat and a nervousness in her hands that Nell recognizes on sight, because she felt that exact nervousness herself, standing in this same barn 15 years ago, holding a journal she was not sure she deserved. Nell walks her through all of it: the scouring line and its unforgiving 20-degree margin, the wheels, the copper pots with their black-green patina, the original color chart still on the barn wall, Walt's faded pencil beside each square, madder and weld and walnut and indigo over gold. And then Nell takes the battered leather journal from its place on the workbench, the brass clasp worn smooth as a river stone by 2 generations of thumbs, and holds it out. Josie opens it. Her eyes move across the first page, across that small, angular handwriting Nell long ago stopped needing to read, because the words are carved into her by now like grain lines in oak. It still has things to say, Nell tells her. Nobody's finished listening yet. Josie looks up, nods, doesn't say anything, doesn't need to. That afternoon, Nell stands in the barn doorway and watches the young woman carry a bale of raw fleece to the wash tanks. Josie's arms strain under the load, and then she adjusts, shifting the weight toward her core, back straight, letting her legs do the work, exactly the way Nell once taught herself in this same doorway with nobody watching. Beyond the barn, the ground is dark and rich, soil that tested at 0.5% organic matter the year Walt died, and tests above 4% now, fed for 15 years by wash water and cattails and everything the word waste turned out to actually mean. The dye acre is coming into bloom, weld and coreopsis and indigo standing in their rows, a full field of color waiting to become color again. The waiting list is 6 months long. And somewhere in Marion County, there is a landfill cell that was surveyed, priced, and never needed. Because on an October morning years ago, a woman with a stock trailer and a dead man's notebook got to the loading dock first. Nell sets the journal on the workbench beside the brass-handled knife and walks out into the morning light where the matter is blooming red along the south fence, exactly where the old man planted it all those years ago, to see what happens. Ladies and gentlemen, right now there are 3 links on your screen. On the left, our newest video. In the center, a square link to our channel. And on the right, a full playlist of stories just like this one. Give this video a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and then enjoy the rest of our videos. Thank you.